This is actually pretty amazing. God must have a specific word for our congregation today, because the Mays basically gave us spark notes of exactly what I'm going to say. So you're going to hear it twice. You better be listening, right? This is from God. Thank you for your sharing. It really did mean a lot, and honestly, it gives a lot of fodder and I think background for what I'm going to be sharing as well. So I appreciate it. We are going to be in John 18. The title of the sermon is No Love Without Trust. No love without trust. We're going to be reading a story in John 18. This is actually a story, right? The last 3 chapters of John are all just Jesus talking or praying. And now it's back to the action. But it means that we have to read it a little bit differently, right? Jesus is not explicitly telling us something. There's a story that we have to follow. And this story, this particular one, is near and dear to my heart. It's the story of Peter's betrayal. One of the few stories outside of the crucifixion that actually appears in all 4 Gospels. You would think for someone like Peter, who was the pillar of the church, that he'd be able to erase some parts of the narrative of the story that he didn't want people to see. But the fact that this is in the Bible and it's over and over again, it's like a crucial part of the story. Or at least we see it that way. It tells me that Peter talked about this a lot. Peter wasn't ashamed to say that he had abandoned Christ, despite the shame and the weeping that we see in this story, because of how it turned his heart towards Christ ultimately. So we're not only going to read about his lack of trust and the challenges that come with difficult situations, with our fears and anxieties, but we're also going to see through the process how God is in control the whole way through. Amen? I want you to pay particular attention as we read to the contrast that's presented here. The writer chose to write this in a specific way. The story starts with Jesus, then we see Peter respond, then we see Jesus, then we see Peter, then we see Jesus, and then we see Peter again. It clearly articulates, I think, that we're meant to read it and draw contrast between the two. We see Jesus' actions in this situation, we see Peter's actions. They're in conflict with each other. They're completely different. And it teaches us what it means to trust God and what it looks like when we don't. Is that fair? Are you following me? Okay. Let's read. John 18, starting in verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Back to Peter. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside of the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I'm not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing there, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in the synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, "Aren't you one of his disciples too? Are you? Or you aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. And we know from the other accounts that it was also at this time that Peter wept. The rooster reminded him of what Jesus had said, that you will betray me, and kind of brought him back. So, we're gonna start at the beginning here, and we're gonna progress one piece at a time through this. It's easy to look at Peter initially in this story and say, "Wow, what a brave young lad, fighting for his Lord, whipping out the sword, getting dirty." That's not what happens. And it's interesting because if you see it that way and you see, wow, Peter was really brave, and then you see him immediately afterwards, you're like, that's not the same person. It can't be the whole story, right? Peter's story is not that he was brave and that he was the only one willing to stand up for Jesus. He may have thought that's who he was, but it's a little bit different. We need to ask a question that we often need to ask ourselves, which is, why? Why did he do this? Right? You often get to the end of something. I mean, I bet Peter, at the end of all this, is like, why? Why would I do that? And that's what we're going to ask. Peter, here, it's very important to note the sequence of events, because you'll miss it. Jesus has a crowd approaching him. He goes, initiates, and says, "Who are you looking for? I'm he." Then he says, "You want me? Leave these guys alone." The implication there is this whole group of people who came with weapons were expecting a fight. Maybe they were expecting to arrest all of them. And Jesus says, leave these guys alone. You want me. Leave these guys alone. It's only after that point, right? Immediately after Jesus is like, leave these guys alone, I'm trying to save their lives, right? That's when Peter decides to strike. Interesting, right? It puts it in a different light. In the Gospel of Luke, it says, when Peter realized what was happening, he strikes. And so here's the real narrative that's going on. Peter thinks he knows better than Jesus what should happen. And when he sees it not going the way he thinks, he tries to change it. This is like me yesterday. Linnea was working on the website. I came in, I started offering all these suggestions. And she's like, "I have a plan. Like, leave me alone." Not quite like that. She's a lot more gentle than that. But clearly, Jesus had a plan here for him, and he says, "No, I've got a better idea. I'm gonna tell you what to do, Jesus, because you can't get arrested here. It's interesting. So he also came in, it seems like he wanted a fight. Can you relate to that? You come into a conversation and you know what's right. You're like, all right, let's get this started. The other guys want to fight, we want to fight, let's go. Right? And Peter has this bravado about him. He's like, let's go. But clearly he was in the wrong. Maybe he just wanted to prove himself. He had said earlier, even if I have to die for you, I would never forsake you. So he's like, this is it. This is my moment. Maybe he thought Jesus came to fight. And he's like, all right, well, who's going to start this? Me. Maybe he thought it was better to die than to watch Jesus go silently. Because that was not the expected. That just blew his mind in this moment. He had no idea that was coming. Even though Jesus kind of told, right? You read the gospel, you're like, Jesus kept telling him over and over again, like, I have to leave. I'm preparing a place for you. I got to go. I'm going to leave you guys. Someone else is coming. They still didn't get it. But whatever Peter thought, what's demonstrated here is that it didn't go the way he planned. He took things into his own hands. And this represents for us, I think, an enduring principle of our Christian walk. The hardest moments of our walk are not doing the hard things, per se. Peter probably thought, man, I'm sacrificing myself. The hardest part of your walk is literally sometimes just admitting you're wrong. Just admitting you're wrong. Peter would rather die than consider an alternative to what he thought should happen. This shows his heart. It's revealed. And I think for us, it's not just about being right. It's also about being in control. You want to control the argument. You want to control the situation. You want things to happen as you see fit. And when they don't, what then? What then? I had a conversation. This is another story. We had a conversation about a car. I thought I knew exactly, we're looking for a new car. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. She's like, well, maybe it's not right because of this. I'm like, why are you attacking me? What's wrong with you? And I felt that for hours. I was like sitting there later. I was like, man, I feel attacked. But like, I just didn't consider all the alternatives, right? I didn't want to be wrong. I wanted what I wanted. And that's a pretty low stakes thing compared to what we're seeing here. But it should cause us to reflect. By contrast, think of Jesus, right? While Peter was sleeping the previous night, Jesus wept and prayed for God to teach him submission. This moment where Jesus is able to submit was not an accident. This is Jesus weeping at God's feet, asking for help. And we cannot be submissive or trust God without the same kind of active involvement in our faith. Jesus confronts the situation directly. He sees them coming. He doesn't go, oh, let's see what happens. He says, hey, you're looking for me? I'm right here. Leave these guys alone. That confidence, that shows his trust in God. And that confidence comes from the praying. It comes from being in tune with God's plan, the cup that God had for him. We have to be like that too. If we sleep on the preparation, if we sleep on the trusting part, we're going to just act on instinct whenever those moments come to test us. Right? You walk into a difficult conversation with your spouse, with your roommate, with your children, with your parents, with someone you're trying to teach. Are you walking into that thinking, I got this? I've done this before. How hard can it be? Oh, Jesus has protected me in the past. It'll be good. Or do you really put yourself in God's hands, asking for advice, seeking wisdom? I think, too, if we're angry, if we find that we're constantly angry, this is a symptom. This is a symptom of a lack of trust in God. And you have to look at that and say, what am I really angry about? What am I really upset about here? If Christ was willing to go to the cross for me, was willing to protect me, what am I fighting about? All right. Still with me? Whew. Part 1. We call that part, put down your sword. Jesus' command, which I think is appropriate for all of us. In part 2, we see Peter again. Now, if you look at this cursorily, you think Peter's flip-flopping like a madman. Whew. Brave Peter. What's the word? Cowardly Peter, exactly. But knowing a little bit of context, you can imagine, right? Peter could have come out of this trusting, wow, okay, Jesus said what he said. Clearly he knows what he's doing. But he comes out of this having cut someone's ear off, aggravated some people, ashamed because Jesus just rebuked him and running away. And there are consequences to that lack of trust. He now comes out. Imagine being in this place, right? He must be thinking, those might be the last words I spoke to Jesus. Do I want the last interaction I had with my Lord to be him rebuking me? No, you don't want that. Perhaps he thought Jesus was abandoning them. Or maybe he thought, I don't even know Jesus anymore. Which kind of makes sense because later he's like, I don't know the man. Clearly, he didn't do what I expected, so clearly something's wrong. His plan is shattered, and now we find he has nothing left. He's just a blank slate, right? This is what happens when we rely so much on ourselves and we don't trust God. That gets broken, and then what? You get stuck, and you sit there and you go, oh man, you start to just roll back all of it. You're like, oh, maybe he's not the Lord. Maybe God is not who he says he is. Oh, maybe the Bible isn't real. Oh, maybe, right? This happens. And so we see Peter sitting by the fire, warming his hands, just doing the most basic thing you can do. And it says it twice, so you know that this was clearly all he was doing. Just sitting there, warming his hands. And these people must have been talking about Jesus. Jesus is literally over there. He can hear him, presumably. In Luke, it says Jesus looked at Jesus. Jesus looked at Peter in the middle of this interaction, right? So they're close enough. Peter can hear what's going on. In fact, Jesus even says, it's kind of wild when you think about it this way. He's like, I always taught openly. Ask the people who were following me what I said. And so Peter's like, don't ask me. I'm just here. I just work here, right? Maybe he doesn't want to suffer. Maybe he feels super uncomfortable with the situation because it's out of his control. Things were all wrong in the past. Regardless of exactly what he's thinking, what we do know is that fear is holding him hostage. We know in Hebrews 2, it says this, that Jesus came to free us who all our lives were held in slavery to the fear of death. Fear is a slave owner over you if you let it rule your life. And that's where Peter is at. He doesn't trust God, and that introduces all these fears into his life. If you don't trust God, this was literally said earlier, right? When you don't have that confidence, when you don't believe that God is going to follow through, then what leads you? Fear starts to drive you. And how do you know? Well, you know that fear is driving when you start to do all the things you said you wouldn't. Peter said, I will never forsake you. And here he is. we say all the time, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to do that again. Oh, I'm so sorry, I won't do that again. Right? But we find ourselves back in situations where we know the right thing, we know what we're supposed to do, and we don't. I want to point out, I'm going to come back to that in a second, because I think it's important. The contrast here we see with Jesus. Jesus is proclaiming the truth despite the consequences. He's on trial. He says, hey, this is who I am. I got nothing to hide. What an incredible joy that comes from having nothing to hide. Before I was a Christian, I had all sorts of stuff to hide. That was my big thing. I was like, I ain't telling nobody about this. Right? And that weighs on you. And Jesus says, I got nothing. I got nothing to hide. Every single thing I did was on display. Ask other people about me. They know. And he's literally walking to his death. He doesn't even fear death at this point because his complete submission and trust in God. It's like a whole nother level here. Right? Just thinking about death sometimes gives us the anxiety. We're like, I don't even know. I don't even know what to think about that. But this is a picture of where we're headed as Christians, right? We are where Peter is. We have all sorts of insecurities and fears, and they drive us in ways we don't like to admit. But as we grow in our faith, we become like Christ. We put aside those fears. We overcome those fears, right? And so this actually gives us a little bit of a framework. You know, I'm inspired by Mario. He doesn't know I was going to share this. Mario has this attitude. He's like, I'm afraid of this, therefore I must do it. Right? Right? He's like, sometimes more successfully than others. But that attitude, I think, is an attitude we need to have as Christians. We look at our life and we say, what am I afraid of still? That's an area where I don't trust God. That's an area where I can grow. I might be afraid of reaching out. Guess what? I used to be absolutely terrified of talking to strangers about Christ. And then John Sloan walked with me for like 3 years and forced me to do it. And I hated it, but then I learned to love it because I saw the impact it was having on people. But then I stopped doing it again, and now I'm afraid again. Right? I have to look at that and contend and say, I'm not okay with this. I don't trust God. I'm not going to see the blessings of God because clearly I'm still afraid to do the work that he's calling me to do. Right? You might have a certain conversation that you're afraid to have. You might be hiding something like what Jesus says. You might be hiding something you're afraid to. Just let it be known. Right? To get the help that you need. You need it. But you're stuck because you're afraid, and then the fear drives what you're doing, and then you stay stuck. Right? The process of living like Christ is pursuing a fearless life. Because trusting in God means becoming fearless like Christ was. It doesn't mean you don't weep and submit, but it does mean you can walk into these situations with confidence. As we bring this story to a close, I've talked a lot about challenges. Honestly, this is a challenging situation for Peter. We wonder why this story has gripped people for centuries, for millennia, right? It just is a powerful story, and I honestly think it's because of how it ends. This rooster crows at the end. Jesus had said, Peter, I know you're ready to die for me. You do love me, but you don't trust me yet. This is not going to go how you think. You're going to betray me before the rooster crows. That rooster planted an anchor in Peter's mind. When he heard it later, it brought him back to his senses. It was a grace from God that despite his failure, despite all the things that he messed up, despite the fact that he has trouble trusting God, Jesus says, I'm going to give you something because this is not the end of your story. This is not where you have to leave off. You don't have to stay stuck. You don't have to stay in this fear. Come, continue to follow me. And when we see this story, we shouldn't see it as, wow, this insurmountable mountain that I have to get to. I have to be fearless, and I have to trust God with everything. No, we should see this as, this is the process. This is the life we're walking. Right? And sometimes we weep at the beginning, and we find confidence in God, and sometimes we weep at the end because we messed up. Right? And we learn to trust God through that as long as we stay close to Jesus. That's what Peter did. He messed up. He didn't know what to do, but at least he kept following him. He kept following him. And I've been through this. You look back at your life, I assume we've all seen this in some respect or another. I had a massive difficulty in leadership. I was in leadership for a number of years. I had a situation that just ripped apart my faith. Missed expectations, I thought it was supposed to go one way. I worked like everything because I thought I was right to make it happen. And it didn't. It didn't. It tore me apart. And honestly, I was left feeling like, what am I even supposed to do? But you take one step at a time. You learn how to trust. One situation at a time. I think my hope is that this is not just giving you some tools and traps, right? Things to watch out for or things to implement, but is inspiring you by God's love to put more and more trust in what Jesus has for you. Let's exercise that. Amen.
So you get to hear me talk some more. First and foremost, we have a midweek service this Wednesday. That is at 7:30 p.m. That is virtual on Zoom. You can find the link at pittsburghchurch.org. It is a congregational midweek, so everybody gets to make their appearance in those dope little squares. Number two, church service is back here at the Fold facility next Sunday at 10:30 a.m., just like it was today. Perfectly not at 10:40. You guys need to do a better job of getting here on time. Yeah, when I'm on stage very much, so when I do, I'm going to crochet. Announcement number 3, reminder, if you have not signed up for a summer book club, this is a cool little plan that James has devised. If you have not signed up for a summer book club, there are 4 different options that you have to join. And we're pacing that out over, 3 months? June, July, August, your typical summer vacation. There are 4 options that you have to join. So these are taking place over our midweek meetings for the most part as well. There's a workshop for the married folk for those, what we call ministry midweeks, when those are scheduled, which is the 3rd Wednesday of each month. So, but that's not to say that the married folk can also join these book clubs. You do have 4 options. First is the 4 Loves, which is by Clive Staples Lewis. That's led by Elizabeth Green, who's our videographer. You also have a book called Radical Love, which is by Randy McKeon, I believe. And that is conducted by Chris, the fellow over there. You also have Prodigal Prophet, which is by Timothy Keller, which is orchestrated by myself. And you also have Crazy which is hosted by Josiah Saunders. He's got a little prop that's holding up. So most of these books, actually all of these books, can be purchased through a variety of venues, whether that's the internet or in the analog form. See those moderators and figure out how to get a hold of those and get going with those readings promptly. And then finally, I would like to introduce to you the Iceman, Matthew Capperell, who has a special announcement about Free Treat.
Thanks, JP. All right, good morning, everybody. So we do have our annual Free Treat coming up. This is a really great opportunity for people to be getting together. It's going to be an invite that's put out to multiple congregations throughout different states, just sort of throughout the region. And I mean, really, anybody can come. We're definitely putting it out there to a lot of other professionals ministries specifically, but there's also going to be more involvement with the church at large as well. So there's definitely going to be a lot of different events that are going to be going on, but that's going to be July 4th weekend. It's going to be starting